Summer 924 Lady. The knock on her door on a fine summer morning woke Osrith up sharply. It was Kaltigar, and he was more than a little agitated. Little had changed since she had arrived back from Tamworth, or, if it had, Osrith was unaware of it. She kept herself isolated from politics, welcomed visitors and offered them hospitality, showed gratitude to Constantine that Domhnall commanded the ships to guard her coast when Norse seemed to be more prevalent. Other than that, she was the lord of the land, presiding over planting and ploughing and harvesting, lambing and slaughter, food preparation for the long winters, and dispenser of justice. She had also been the person both Kaltigar and Rhea had come to see when they had wanted to wed. Osrith could not think of a better match than her estate manager and her kitchen manager. Kaltigar was loyal and quiet, who prayed to God in the secluded manner of the Irish church. Rhea, more lively, attended to her prayers with good spirits, and it was quite clear they loved one another. 2 babies had already been born to them, and another was on the way, and Osrith kept to her schedule of rising at dawn and patrolling her estate. Except for this morning, it seemed, where she had overslept and Kaltigar had had to knock. Lady, Kaltigar called again, and Osrith asked him to wait for a moment. When she was dressed for the day, she called him in and he stood, gravely, by the door. A man was seen, by Bean, crossing your land late last night, he told her. And again this morning. This wasn't unusual. They had been lucky with raids in recent years. She supposed they were due one. This man, do we know anything about him? Only, Kaltigar hesitated, that he terrified the cowherds and made them hide in the bothy. Osrith felt her stomach harden. Some bastard come to cause trouble, then. Increase the guard, Osrith told him. I will come on watch tonight. But, as she was speaking, a figure on a horse rode down from the higher ground in the southwest towards the farm's hall. Osrith went downstairs and waited at the threshold. It was not Finan. If it had been Finan, her heart would have lifted with joy. If he had been with young Finan, her heart would be higher still. Why are you here? Osrith asked him, the barriers of defensiveness rising in her mind. She couldn't help it. She had to be on her guard with Utad around. And now he had come onto her land, whereas before he had made a point of stopping at the boundary, and not just crossing her land. Utad had come to her very door. You scared off my cowherds, Osrith told him, hand on the door frame. Your fences were broken, Utad replied. They were not. Perhaps a trespasser broke them. Perhaps, Utad conceded, indifferently. I have news. What news? Now she felt anxious. Was it Finan, her son? Osrith noticed that Utad had paused to let her think that, to worry her. You should know that Edward of Wessex is dead, Utad told her. And that was that. He had ridden nearly 30 miles to tell her that to her face. Hold on, Osrith called back to her brother. You come into my land, destroyed my fences, scare my people, refuse my hospitality, to tell me this. But, Utad simply turned his horse around and began to ride away, accelerating as he got to the higher ground, before going over the ridge, without even looking back. 88,888,888. Would you ever ask me not to fight? Finan asked Osrith as he kissed her forehead. Osrith looked up. He had arrived back on the afternoon of Utad's unannounced arrival, and was taken aback at the guards who had greeted him. No, I never would, Osrith told him, as she lay in her favorite position, her head on his chest, her arms wrapped around him, while her husband's arms were wrapped around her. And I would never ask you, he told her. Osrith wondered where this was leading. There was always a long run-up when Finan wanted to talk about anything that might be troublesome. Do you remember the last time power was transferred in the kingdoms? He asked her. Osrith looked up, to see his face. When Ethelfled died, you mean? Yes, I do mean that, Finan replied. And how the remaining leaders went off their heads and invaded and took advantage of one another's lands and assets. Finan, Utad deigned to come into our land to tell me this morning, Osrith told him he did. Finan did indeed seem to be genuinely surprised by this. So, you did not have a hand in it? Edward's death? Osrith asked. Finan regularly told her, usually after they had had sex, how it would be that he would kill Edward, or Constantine or Domhnall. Not I, Finan told her, with a grin. I have alibis. What I think, Osrith told him, taking pity on her husband and also to make things much faster, is that I should remain at our land and tend our affairs. And if any such kings and lords come our way, use our garrison for defense. She watched relief spread over Finan's face. I would agree that would be a marvelous idea, Finan told her, and that he, Finan, should return to Bibbenberg. But not yet. Not until Osrith had crept down his body and arranged her mouth over his cock, bringing him to stiffness. Not before he had held her head as she brought him off, his spunk spilling over her mouth. Not before he had turned Osrith over and worked her way down her body, starting at her neck, working his way down her neck, and his hands on her breasts, which he then took in his mouth. Not before he had worked her to closeness, and she him, his cock so large that she wondered, as she always did, how she ever accommodated it, how she had gone on top and ridden her husband, until he could come no longer, until she sank into his arms, until they worked up enough strength to do it all over again. And afterwards, Finan did return to Bibbenberg, and Osrith did ride to the border of her land and Utards to watch him disappear into the distance. And after that, when Osrith had returned to her hall, and stared at her table, something had happened, something unbelievably grave that she stood quite still for a long time, staring at it. Her sword, Buet, had been placed over the seat of her chair. It was a challenge, one given by a Briton to a Briton. It meant, I think you are avoiding your responsibilities. Strap me to your hip, and go. Beroth did not go. Not immediately, anyway, not to see Edward and bow to his shroud, and remember the times she had served him. It was, however, when her son came back to her, returned from Bibbenberg, in ignominy. Finan had sent him back to Berwick for being adamant that he wanted to be a Seelicht, and either not trying, or being lazy, or some other reason she couldn't quite get to the bottom of. Come on, Osrith told him, striding to the stable. The two farmhands who were practicing with Bean stopped, and nodded to Osrith, who smiled at them and waved to show them she wanted them to continue. Where are we going? Young Finan asked, as Osrith handed him Sainid's sword, which she had kept after his death, to support the man who would be king of all of the island of Britain. Athelistan, she added, we are going to fight for Mercia, and ensure that he gets to London, and the crown of Wessex. 88,888,888 except that, when she had got to the Great North Road, her journey took her north instead. Osrith turned her bridle and deliberately went that way. It was clear in her mind that she did this, an image so stark that, on that fateful day some years in the future, she could even see the groundsel and the poppies growing on the scrubby heathland. They had only got as far as Berwick's pack-horse bridge when she realized she had company. I don't know how long I am staying, Osrith told Caltigar and Bean, when they had caught up with her and declared they were coming to the place where Osrith knew, deep down, she would go when Edward died and the turmoil began. Dunnottar had thick walls and mighty rivers and people she loved, and who loved her, and who could protect Berwick. She was going to Alba. 88,888,888 was it Osrith's imagination that it seemed that Constantine was ready to see her? Certainly there were boats available across the Forth from Caldes, where usually at that time of year they were overbooked for merchants and farmers. And her heart began to soar when she saw the guards on the gates and in the ramparts, when she found Uunst at the front gate instructing some of the Morma's sons on how to raise it. And then it goes up, and you latch it on the second hook, to secure it. Osrith finished for him, not the first. No one ever knows why the first one was put there. It was an old instruction, with an added anecdote, that all guards told when given the job of teaching new people. Uunst stared at her. Don't you recognize me with long hair? Osrith asked him. Uunst had to glance to young Finan before any sort of clue came to him. Osrith? He asked, faintly, after the brain cells dug out the right answer from so long ago. Osrith, she confirmed. She was home at Alba, where she belonged. 88,888,888 Osrith could not stop. No, willingly encouraged young Finan to go off to explore the castle, and all of his old haunts. Edra was home, somewhere, having returned from Culdees and her studying of the languages and art that she loved. We had met Kaltigar and Bean, and had taken them to the armory. He has grown, Constantine told her, when she stood before him. He had watched her approach and had waited for her to come, he told her. Like I used to watch you with the fisher boys who used to come, he added. Ulf and Gert, Osrith remembered, Frisian fishermen, who she had liked and played with as a child around Dunnottar Fortress and defended her to Elasade when the woman asked why Osrith's jobs had not been done, who had helped her flee Dunnottar, and had taken her all the way to Hampton when she had run from Albal and had gone instead to search for Utad, in Wessex. They did feed him at Bibbenberg, Osrith told him. But Constantine prompted. And Osrith wished then she was more like Finan, who could string out bad news all day. He did not thrive. I never got to the bottom of why, before we left, Osrith told him. I will train him, or else. Dubkin, Constantine told her. Dubkin? He is a fine warrior, and an excellent teacher. His young fighters have had to turn their interest east, to my shame. East to Strathclyde? Was there unrest there? She had heard that Owain had, if not bowed the knee to Edward, tipped his hat to the King of Wessex. Had the King of Strathclyde taken it further, now? And why did you leave? Constantine asked. It was the question of the day, the ultimate question. And Osrith had to focus to tell him. Because a war is coming, Osrith said, plainly, and I need to be here, inside these walls, with my people for a time. I'm visiting, she added, and Constantine nodded, as if he had known all along, as if it were knowledge so common that it was never ever mentioned. Come, sit, he said to her, crossing to the settle in the alcove of his throne room, the old Constantine returning, the friendly, amiable man Osrith had known from time to time. And she did, and he offered her his hand, and Osrith took it. She hadn't even known she had needed to take it, but when she did, it made her feel much calmer, much more at peace. I take instruction now at Culdees, Constantine told Osrith. Oh, not to become a priest, far from it, he laughed, waving away her astonished expression. I find I can focus on the needs of my kingdom much more if I have had time alone with God. The monks are giving me some excellent insights into His word. Perhaps there is only a particular time in your life when you are ready to receive it. Perhaps, Osrith thought. If it were true, he had the most stable kingdom in the whole of the island of Britain. Norse were contained, skirmishes were handled. Whoever is Edward's successor will believe the alliance you held with Ethelflaed was a submission document, she postulated. What does Owain say? And that was when she discovered that Constantine at war with Norse of Strathclyde and Owain, who let the Norse settle. He has an understanding with Edward that the West Saxons will keep the Norse in check, as long as Owain accepts Edward's overlordship. Yes, of the three kingdoms, only two survived as a union, but Owain was far more Gaelish-orientated, culturally, than he was Saxon. He would see that, Osrith was sure. Accepted, Osrith said, softly. Constantine turned and took her hand. Tell me, after all these years, did you love him, Edward? Osrith gave a faint smile but shook her head. No, she told him, I liked him, served him. And Constantine told her about Edra, and her time at Culdees. How she had been working with the monks and furthering her knowledge of the languages that she loved. Come with me, Mater, Edra urged, with the bright, confident manner of someone who was used to getting their own way. You do not need to train today. Osrith thought differently, but she yielded to the enthusiasm of her daughter and allowed her to take her over the water to Culdees. This is what I have been working on, she told her mother, and Osrith gasped as she saw a large letter C which was being illuminated with gilt and blue and red. The part she had done looked as if there was light radiating out from the page, and she felt a stab of guilt that she had doubted in her mind that Edra could produce work of such beauty. Beda says if it is good enough it will be included in the gospel book that Atrs having made, Edra told Osrith, showing her the pages that other monks had made. The Iona one was taken, lost, or burned by the Norse when they invaded there, so this is a copy of what we know was in it. Young Finan used to help me, before he went to his father, Edra added. He liked it a lot, as he liked listening to the stories a monk showed him, and he has learned them by heart. Of course he did, Osrith told Edra, smiling, and then a thought occurred to her. Beda, is he an elderly monk? Did he come from Lindisfarne's young man? If it was the same man, he had treated her hand when she had been shot at by arrows from Bibenberg when she was trying to escape. He must have been over 70 if it was him. Yes, Edra agreed. He helps me with everything, shows me the written documents of Denmark and Norway. She glanced at her page. And Irian and Pitland and Dulriata too, she added, loyally. The Gospels are like the ones you told me about, when you went to Doia, do you remember? Yes, Osrith replied, stiffly, not wishing to be reminded of her time there. To Edra, though, Osrith's life was all matter of fact. And he showed me how to tell the sticks, Edra continued, reaching into a drawer and pulling out set of runesticks, wrapped up in a linen cloth. He showed me a document which told me, she admitted. No, Osrith declared, as Edra was about to tip them out. Not in a monastery. And she and Edra went out into the pasture behind the monastery and walked in the merry sunshine. Yet, Osrith had done worse, with the trainee monk, Andra, she recalled. Edra found a flat part of the ground and threw them out. Those there, she told Osrith, means conflict. And those there, new life, and a good harvest, and good fishing. Things are going well for you. For me? Osrith asked. You read the runesticks for me? Edra smiled. And no doubt, if I told you we are having good growing and fishing weather, and that the king of the West Saxons has died, so this is the conflict and the new life, and that all I had to do was to listen to information from the kingdoms, and Mund. Edra thought about this for a second, and then said to Osrith, I am glad to see that the runesticks agree. And Osrith brought her to her arms and gave Edra a hug. I am glad you want to know your heritage, Osrith told her. And Anlaf. At this, Edra blushed. Athair told me I can marry him still, or I need not, if I do not wish. And what do you wish? Osrith asked. To marry Anlaf, her daughter told her. But Athair, men see daughters as treaties, Osrith told her. They do not remember hearts and feelings. And that a daughter's life will change when she marries. Don't let him have too much of a say, or he will have you in this monastery for the rest of your life. You need to live, Osrith added. Like you did? Edra asked. There was no malice in it, and Osrith took her daughter's hand. Not like I did. I would never recommend my life to anyone. I just mean, give yourself a chance to leave Dunnottar, and see what the world is like, and come back, like you, Edra told her. How was it that this bright young woman was so insightful? I am proud you are my daughter, Osrith told her, and then watched Edra's face brighten. Mathair, I have something to show you, she told Osrith, and she hurried into the monastery, Osrith behind her. Can you read it? She asked Osrith, after laying a small piece of parchment on the writing table. The sunlight lit up the letters as it shone through the large window. Cymric is hard for me. Osrith could. And she told Edra that, whoever this person was, owned 50 hides and 300 acres at Amont Bridge, Penrith, in Cumbraland. This is a transcript of a real document that was sent with the person whose name is written on the other side, Edra told Osrith. And Osrith turned it over and saw, in neat handwriting, that the owner was one Gwyddulf of Caerligwylid. Gwyddulf? Osrith asked, looking at the document again, before resting her eyes on Edra's animated face. My father could not pronounce her name, she told me this sometimes, and she changed it to her Fejaitha. Osrith smiled, as she remembered her mother. So, my mother inherited land and animals from her country. It must be Utad's now. And she thought of the sheaf of documents that Father Bacor had saved for her brother. The land and titles for Bibenberg. Was the original of her mother's with these? No. Edra said. Of course not. Of course not? Osrith repeated, and watched an expression of disbelief cross her daughter's face. Yours, you mean? Edra said. If I had been a man, Osrith mused. And Edra shook her head. Don't tell me you have never heard of Brehon law. Osrith thought, then shook her own head. Brehon law is the law of Irian, of the Gaels, on which the church is based. It has specific things in it, Edra continued, including, and she pointed to Gwyddolf's name, a mother passing on the land to her daughters. She then waved a hand. As you are her only daughter, this is yours alone, and there is no question of dividing it equally, Edra added. You are saying the land belonging to my mother's is mine? Yes, Edra said, simply. Wasn't the claim to Cumbraland through your mother, when you married Guthred? Osrith said nothing, but glanced out of the window. She really did not want to be reminded of her time at Caerliguilid. Her life seemed to have got worse and worse from that time, until she had fought vagabonds who had attacked Lord Odda, and he had taken her into his service. Yes, Osrith told her. Edra shook her head, and glanced down to Osrith's paper again. Then, it is plausible, that the land that Guthred had became yours, on his death. Osrith stared. This was unbelievable. Could she really think that there was land that she could claim under a law system she had never heard of? And it could give her Cumbraland? Yes, Edra told her, disbelievingly. You really don't know, Mater? No, that's ridiculous, Osrith told her. But Edra smiled. You don't know about Brehon law? Who does? Why, everybody, Edra told her. Ask Ealacid, Glimmery, ask the Mormers, ask the stable boy and Ater, and, Edra broke off, and frowned. What is the name of the land that your family came from? That Gwyddolf came from? Cumbraland? Osrith asked, blankly. No, Edra said, ponderously. It covered north of the wall. It went to the Clyde? Osrith asked. So, Edra told her mother, authoritatively, Brehon law says property is passed down the female line. This is your land, she added, pointing to the parchment. And Cumbraland is your land, because of Guthred, because you married him. But Edra held up a hand. Because, she told Osrith, answering the question her mother was struggling to even ask, you owned land prior to his claim. He was crowned, was he not? Yes, Osrith replied, weakly. So it is your land, Edra told her. And if Cumbraland is your land, the kingdom that was prior to Cumbraland and Strathclyde is also yours. Edra, you should be a law-sayer, Osrith told her. A skalk? She told her. Not a poet. No, Edra told her. A skald is much more than that. They remember land deeds, inheritance, who is bonded to who has an oath to whom and who has broken one. She looked about at the tightly packed shelves. I have been given such an opportunity here. If I had been left in Winchester. She tailed off. If she had been left in Winchester, she would have died. If Osrith had not gone to selfishly unburden herself to Thyra, who had already suffered so much, and still had room to listen to Osrith, she would not have dragged her from the flames. How different her own life would have been, Osrith knew. For only the thought of keeping Edra alive, and finding a place of safety for her, had compelled her to return to Alba. You know your father, Bokar, was a law-sayer, she told him. Or a law-writer, so to speak. He was a very knowledgeable man. In fact, there was little he did not know. Osrith shook her head. I wish I had listened more, and not escaped up into the rafters and pretended to have worked, she told Edra. It is good to know that about him. She sighed, as she folded the parchment containing the valuable information and handing it to her mother. It is a pity that Brehon law does not apply to my family. She looked at Osrith. I don't suppose you would know what land my grandmother would have had, do you? Osrith shook her head. Ragnar, your grandfather, took land south of Bibbenberg. I don't think that the Danes kept many written documents. Oh, that's where the Skalds come in, Edra said, brightly. They remember the history. She looked at the shelves, and then further along, to a table containing what looked like a map, and beckoned Osrith with her. She looked, and could see the map had places such as Stirling and Dunkeld and Glashku written onto it. Here is Caerliguilid, Edra said, pointing. And the Roman wall, and the Seaston Uid, at the coast. Osrith nodded. So where is Bibbenberg? Osrith pointed, and further up, at what looked like the course of a river. She pointed again. Berwick, she told Edra. And here, Melrose, where your father lived, and Culdees, She pointed to the south of the fourth. Here Dunnottar. And where is Rst? Edro asked. And Osrith located Caligulid, and Glashku, and drew a line with her finger between the two. But there is also the area with huge lakes. Not even the Romans could tame the people there. And here, Osrith squinted, is a Mont Bridge. She blinked, and looked at the territory again. If she compared it to the east coast, the area covered almost the same area as Bernicia. It made sense. It was very powerful. Hundreds of years ago, the Hen-Ogled, people of the north, had Coel-Hen, King Cole, and Urian, who fought at Catrajin, was betrayed by Morkant of Dunedain. She looked at the map again. No trace of a place called Dunedain now. She had never even heard of it. Had Morkant's treachery been fatal to a whole people? But I would need an army to take it, Osrith thought aloud. I don't think my dozen farm boys, even with their warrior training, would manage it. And I think Owain would take exception to my invading his land. Matter, you always think so ... Marshally. Everything with you is battle and fighting. You just need a declaration. A declaratin? Yes, the girl replied, brightly. At a place such as Stirling. Yes, Stirling, she told her mother, as if Osrith was now immediately planning to do this. Because King Domhnall brought the stone from Irian, and she traced a rough route that Domhnall might have travelled from Team Reach to Stirling, as Osrith took in Ratlin and Iona and Dunder's destinations in between. And so, she concluded, this represents the planting of Brehon law being physically brought into law, transferring from Irian, through the king, through the church, even through the earth itself. It was eloquent. Osrith would give her that. And she would take Edro any day to represent her interests in law. Maybe if she was up for the murder of her brother, for example. And yet, Osrith thought, I am still stuck in the idea of a Witten, where the next king was decided, which was why Ethelwold did not become king, because the Witten did not think him throne-worthy, and that men inherited and women didn't. This Brehon law was alien to everything she knew. It sounds wonderful, Osrith told Edra, when they had crossed the Forth and were walking the short grass towards Dunnottar. But the land would have gone to my father. Edra laughed. Haven't you been listening, Mutha? The land never went to your father, because under Brehon law, it is yours. And she continued to talk about the pigments she was getting, that Constantine was buying for her illumination. A blue, called lapis that came from so far away no one had ever drawn it on a map. Another came from a rock from the land the Romans came from, that gave a green. And Osrith, who then went to see her son work through his exercises against Eswi, who flashed her a smile and nodded approvingly to young Finan, thought about the deed of land for Beric, that Constantine had come all the way to the farm to give her into her hand. No mention of Finan's name, or Sainid's. The document said the land was hers. Osrith of Beric, it had said. A week later, the Trinity returned to Dunnottar, Domhnall's flagship, with the rest of the fleet, limping in battered but proudly carrying all her crew. Osrith watched them inch up the Forth, powered by oar once they had rounded the headland. As she watched the sailors get ashore, it was then she knew that she needed to leave. Sainid was not here, and life had moved on, and she needed to go back to the land that was once his, and his family's. And she went to watch them come in, tired and injured, not knowing that this was the best she would ever see the Alba Navy return. Then, she turned to the courtyard. Bean was training outside Dunnottar's stables under Drostan tutelage while Dobkin nodded approvingly, while young Finan fought with one of the younger training boys. He seemed a little behind in his sword skill, but was getting better by the day, and Osrith wondered what he had learned in the 4 years he had been with his father at Bibbenberg, or what he had not. If it was to fight that he had been sent to Bibbenberg, young Finan had not learned a great deal. And when she made to discuss his time with his father and his uncle, he just shrugged, and said that he had tried to do what they had told him to do. So Osrith went to find the king. The longest day was approaching, and it felt right to return to her lands for the lean month, before harvest. Here, Osrith said to Constantine, she might never have known she still had a hoard of silver, brought back that time from Heavenfield, when Constantine had fought the Norse that she had hidden in the stables, had it not been for a coin that fell out of a crack in the hoof of a horse that was being led around to the blacksmith. It had still been there, the greasy leather bag, and in it, hack silver, from Norse jewelry, arm rings and the like. Osrith, Constantine exclaimed, for she had come to his chamber, and he was still dressing. Come in, he added. She waited until his manservant had pulled his cloak around him, standing by the door until it closed behind young Alast, Elasade's grandson. What is this? He asked, when she held up the bag. I want him to stay here, Osrith told Constantine. Why, what has happened? I don't know, Osrith told him. I do know he is behind in his sword skill. I do know he misses his home. For when she had mentioned they could stay a little longer, young Finan's eyes shone. They dimmed when she mentioned Beric. Silver, Osrith told him, but he raised his hand and struck the purse from hand. Anger flashed behind his eyes. I do not need silver to care for my own son, Constantine told her. Your own dash, Osrith echoed, shaking her head. She was shocked if Constantine truly thought young Finan was his. Tell me it not possible, and I will take your silver, Constantine told her. Is it possible? And Osrith shook her head again, then bent down to pick up the silver. She glanced this face. His features were fixed, just for a moment, and then he smiled. By that, I, of course, mean that, like Edra, I am a father to him. Of course, he told Osrith in his diplomatic tone. It is only right that a mother wishes to send her son somewhere in particular.